In this unit, we're exploring what being a Christian actually means. And in our last session, we explored one of Jesus' stories about the Good Samaritan. Now, before we start this session, I want us to look back at the last session and think about what message do you think Jesus was giving when he told this story of the Good Samaritan. Pause the video and have a little think, and then come and join me when you're ready. Now, the moral to this story relates to one of the two important commands that Jesus told Christians to follow. And this was the second command, which was, you must love your neighbour as yourself. And the story of the Good Samaritan shows us exactly what it means to be someone's neighbour. And it explains to people that we should love everyone, including our Samaritans, just as the Samaritan loved his enemy, the Jew in this case. In this session, we're going to be trying to answer the question of who was Saint Paul. And we're going to be learning about what his life was like and thinking about what we could learn from his experience as a Christian. So when looking at the story of Saint Paul, we have to go back to the beginning. And Saint Paul was actually born as Saul, and he was born in the city of Tarsus around the same time that Jesus was alive. Now, Saul's parents were Jewish, and they taught him how to live in accordance with the Jewish faith. Saul went to school in Jerusalem and learned all about the laws of God, and then went on to become a Pharisee. Now, Pharisees were a group within Jewish religion who strictly followed the laws of God, and also made sure that others followed these laws. So a little bit like a religious police force. Now, it was around this time that Saul began to hear rumours that the Messiah had come, and he heard that God had sent his son Jesus to save everyone from their own sins. Now, the news and teachings of Jesus were spreading, but Saul was not happy about this, as he didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, or that he was spreading the word of God. Instead, he believed he would have been a revolutionary, someone who was going to cause problems for the Roman Empire, who were occupying Israel at this time. But many people in Jerusalem were believing what Jesus said, and instead of following Saul's example, they began to follow Jesus. Saul became increasingly worried about how the teachings of Jesus were spreading, and he wanted to put an end to this, and did everything he could to stop Jesus' followers from spreading the news. Saul believed he was doing this in God's name, as he wanted to protect God and the people from what he thought was a false Messiah. When Jesus died, much to Saul's dismay, people didn't stop talking about him and the lessons that he'd been teaching. So Saul went on a mission to stop Jesus' followers, and he was granted permission to travel to a place called Damascus to arrest any follower of Jesus. And it was on this journey to Damascus that something amazing happened. Saul met the risen Jesus, who appeared to him in a great, bright light. Saul heard a voice speak to him, and he asked who it was. Jesus told him that he was Jesus, the Son of God, and the promised Messiah. Now, Saul was sure that Jesus was dead. He'd heard that he'd died on the cross and was buried. So at first, Saul was terrified. But then, he realised that Jesus really was the one that God had promised to send. And he knew that he'd been wrong and had been fighting against God rather than for God. Jesus told Saul to continue to Damascus, and when he arrived there, to wait. Now, the bright light disappeared, but it also left Saul blinded and weak, so some of his friends had to help to lead him to the town of Damascus. When he arrived in Damascus, another follower by the name of Ananias came to Saul and placed his hands on him. Immediately, Saul's blindness disappeared and he was able to see again, and he also managed to regain his strength. Now, Saul knew that this transformation was God's doing. He knew that he now had a job to do. He had to spread the news of God and his Son, Jesus. From this time, Saul began to preach about God and his son Jesus, and he preached to his friends, in his community and in the synagogues. Jews and friends began to distrust Saul, as he no longer shared their beliefs, as these people still believed that Jesus was a false Messiah. Now Saul left for Jerusalem and asked the followers if he could join their group. The followers were not sure if they could trust Saul, as he had previously tried to arrest many of them. But then the followers accepted that Saul truly did want to join them, and that he had been transformed by God. Saul continued to preach and spread the word of God, and the number of followers grew and grew. Saul was finally baptized and was given the name Paul, as Saul was a Jewish name. He became known as Saint Paul after his death, as he suffered and worked hard to share God's teachings, and continued to share the news of Jesus up until he was sentenced to death by his enemies. One of the ways that Paul was able to spread the teachings of Jesus was through a series of letters, and we find these in the New Testament. We actually find 13 books of Paul's letters in the New Testament, and these contain the teachings that he was trying to spread across the empire. Here we can see an extract from one of the many letters that St. Paul wrote to the Christians explaining Jesus' teachings. This one is from one of his letters to the Christians who lived in the town of Corinth. Love is patient, it is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonour others, it is not self-seeking or easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil but rejoices with the truth. It always trusts, always protects, always hopes, always perseveres. I want you to think about the message that St. Paul is trying to convey and how this links with the teaching that we've already looked at within this unit. Thinking about those very original 2 commandments that Jesus gave. The Lord our God is the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second, you must love your neighbour as yourself. So I want you to think about how this letter, how this message that St. Paul is trying to convey teaches the Christians of Corinth about Jesus' teachings, about those 2 commandments. So pause the video, have a think about these words, and share with someone how you think that St. Paul is passing over that message. For your independent activity, I'm going to ask you to go to the website and find the Saul Becomes St. Paul worksheet, which is a series of 10 questions that are going to really show your understanding about this transformation, about this journey that the Jewish Saul had to become the Christian Paul. How someone who believed that Jesus was a false Messiah, someone who was spreading lies and causing problems, was actually the true Messiah, giving teachings that will help people to get that everlasting life. And before you do go and have a little exploration of that sheet and answer those questions to show your learning and your understanding of this event, on the screen I've left you an image. This one's one of my favourites of St. Paul on the road to Damascus and the conversion that he had. And this one you'll find, if you want to see it in real life, you'll find in the Louvre in Paris. And it was painted by a man called Hans Speckard in around 1577 or so. So while you're thinking about this, I want you to see this image and see what's actually happening, see whether you can spot all those different elements that we've just discussed and explored within this story of Saul becoming St. Paul on that road to Damascus. And once you're ready, feel free to go onto the worksheet and complete those answers, and as always I will look forward to seeing your work. Good luck.